We are so excited today to have on our program Rebecca Cooper, who has written the book, Hey God, Yes Charles. And we're going to get to talking about your book in a minute, Rebecca, but I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that happened that led up to the book. So this all started when your husband died unexpectedly.
It did. I felt like at the time that there were probably thousands of prayers that got sent up when Charles was unexpectedly stricken, and over 13 days he was unconscious and fought it, but he died anyway. And when that happened, it just seemed to me that God hadn't heard any of the prayers, and I was sort of done. I thought, you know, I've said all I have to say. But then it kind of felt like Charles wasn't done. He was up there in heaven, and he was talking to God, and they were having these conversations, and I just began to sort of scribble down what it seemed like I was hearing. And over the course of that first year, they had a lot of conversations on a lot of topics, usually pertaining to something I was doing, and it was helpful and insightful. And by that year, I had pieces of paper scribbled everywhere, and that's kind of how it started.
Can you give us an example of what one of those conversations was?
Well, probably the best one is when Charles is expressing concern about me because I'm not praying anymore. And God just says, that's all right, I can handle the attitude. And so I think that I learned from that over time, although it took a while. I could try to discard God if I wanted to, but God wasn't going to discard me.
You. So these conversations that you're hearing or feeling or doing, and they seem to be addressing some of the kinds of maybe things that are going on inside you. You're angry at God and you're turning away and you don't want to talk to him, but the same way somewhere inside of you, you're like, I need to, or I should be praying. And then you hear these sort of comforting conversations between your husband and God. And how did that make you feel when you heard those things?
At the time, just to be truthful, I really didn't think about it. I just sort of had this compulsion to write down what it seemed like I was hearing. When I look back now, though, I realize how therapeutic that must have been for me as a way to work through whatever that day happened to bring. And it was hard that first year. Every day is an anniversary of something. It might be Valentine's, it might be your anniversary, but it might also be the first January 3rd in 39 years that I have awakened that morning without talking and seeing my husband.
Yeah. Let's talk about grief for a little bit, because I think that a lot of people, the experience you've had over hearing the conversations is probably a bit unusual, but grief is something that many people, as we talked about earlier, have gone through. Tell us what that's like when it happens unexpectedly, and what kinds of things you feel and think and do in those first days after that happens.
That first round, I felt like I'd been hammered into the ground, and my mother died 4 weeks after Charles did, and I'm an only child. And so I lost his presence at her death and her presence at his death. And I really did not know which way to turn, but I have a lot of family and friends, and they just sort of stood by with the net and to help me through it and pick me up when I needed that. But I think that navigating those days, you just feel like you're in such unknown territory. It's surprising in the first place, and then every day brings a new challenge, something else you have to do. The first time that I checked the box that says widow on a form, it just about took me to my knees. And so for somebody who's going through that, and I've had conversations with people who want to talk about that with me, and I always feel like I never fail to disappoint, because I know they want a magic answer. I did, and there isn't one. Time is your friend, and you have to use time, but you also, I think, have to allow yourself that time to grieve as long as you want to, however you want to. And then at some point, if you can, just be open to the possibility of a future. And I think when I look back now, through these conversations, through the help of family and friends, through my church, through the spiritual base that I had been given through my parents as well, that's what happened to me, and I'm grateful for that.
Rebecca, tell me about Charles. Was he a praying man? And was he the spiritual leader in your marriage?
He was, and he was a mess. Charles was a pistol, and so he was one of these neat guys that you were willing to, go along with and do. But he set a great example for our family and for our children. Loved our little church. Our pastor said it was one of the greatest losses that he felt like he had experienced when he realized that Charles was not going to survive, what was going on at the hospital here in Atlanta at the time. And so for us, married at 19, high school sweethearts, we did realize that we had kind of lucked out with kind of the same values and the same background, and just able to grow that over the years. And it's also no surprise to me, because Charles was always working the room, that he's working the room in heaven with God, and finally answering some of those questions that we always wondered about, and that God would engage.
Awesome. So he's looking out for you in life and in eternity, and having those conversations in life and eternity. That's so beautiful.
And I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
What was the most surprising thing you overheard?
I think Charles trying to negotiate with God, which, if I thought about it later, it shouldn't have been, but I got tickled at it. For example, on the day of Charles's service, it happened to be the SEC championship game. He's a huge UT Volunteers fan, and so we had a television at his service, so that the folks and friends there wouldn't miss the game, because Charles wouldn't have had it any other way. Well, we lost to LSU, and I could just hear Charles in heaven going, God, just that one time. And God's going, no. That was Charles.
What a wonderful memory. I mean, just amazing. Amazing.
Yeah.
So you went through those first weeks, they were kind of a blur, and then probably for the first year, like you said, it's an anniversary of the third Thursday of February where he's not here, and so it's not even Christmas and New Year's, although those I'm sure are especially poignant, but just having to check a box, do those kinds of things. What strength did you have to get through those periods of time? Where did your strength come from if you weren't talking to God at that point in time? And
I think that a lot of different directions. For one thing, our Lord Church just stood under me, wall to wall, circled the wagons, elbow to elbow. Family and friends did the same. But I have to say, my dad, mentioned earlier, I'm an only child. It occurred to me somewhere along the way that I had lost a husband and a mother, but he had lost a son and a wife. And I started watching him, and he was modeling, handling his losses. He and my mother had been together over 60 years. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm modeling for my children and grandchildren. They're going to be watching me just like I'm watching him. And I think that was a big turning point for me. I was so appreciative of his Christian background, all the things that he and my mother had taught me, and then I watched him live it at the lowest point in his life, and it meant a lot.
so then you go through the second year, and a lot of people who maybe stood by you in the beginning now are moving on to other things, or other people who are sick. How is the second year different than the first year?
It's natural, of course, for people to do that, and I was told that the second year is harder than the first, and I just about fainted when I heard that, because you don't really think that that's possible. But in some ways, there's truth to that. For me, in my second year, it came on the heels of scribbling all of these conversations, and because I had mentioned it to someone, a couple of people had said, you need to find all those pieces of paper and pull them together and at least put them in some kind of notebook form for your children and grandchildren to have to read someday. So I sort of spent that second year looking for all of that stuff, and I had pieces of paper everywhere in the car, in drawers, in purses, in the closets, because I would just scribble it down wherever I happened to be when I heard it. So part of the second year for me was involved in recovering those pieces of paper. And when I read them then, really kind of for the first time, then the pieces, literally and figuratively, almost kind of began to come together for me. And I thought, wow, this is what you've been doing. This is where you've been headed. And even during those darkest hours, it was helpful to reflect back on why that had happened and why it felt like that I was realizing that Charles was okay. I could set aside the guilt that he died and I didn't, and it was going to be all right for me to get okay too.
What's beautiful, I think, about looking at that is you had these little grace notes or sticky notes or backs of receipts where just little notes of conversations that you overheard, just bits of grace. And then they disappeared for a while as you went about life and accumulated more of them or changed purses or did that. And then at some point they came back and you were ministered to them, you know, they spoke to you and comforted you and gave you a perspective that you didn't have before. And so during that whole point where you're like, God, I'm angry and I don't think you're listening to me, and I'm not sure you're here, with a little bit of distance and perspective, you're able to look back and see how active he was in all of that, from the conversations to the notes you took, to bringing him back at the right time, all of that. And I think to me that's just a wonderful testimony of how much God loves us, that he's working even during those difficult hours and during that time. What's really cool is that those little grace notes that started out have now become a grace book. And we want to talk more about that after the break. So stay tuned. We're going to come back and talk more with Rebecca Cooper about her book.